The rain began before sunrise and never stopped. By evening, the streets were wet, the sky was dark, and the city felt quiet and heavy. Inside a small cafe near the corner of Maple Street, Daniel Carter sat alone at a table near the window. His coffee had gone cold, but he had not noticed. His eyes were fixed on the door. He was waiting for someone he had trusted, almost like family. Mark Bennett. For 10 years, Daniel and Mark had built their construction company together. It started with nothing more than a pickup truck, borrowed tools, and a dream. Back then, they worked from Daniel's small garage. They spent long nights drawing plans, calling clients, and chasing opportunities that most people ignored. It was not easy. There were months when they barely paid their bills. Sometimes Daniel wondered if the company would survive, but Mark always believed it would. He had confidence, energy, and a strong voice that could convince almost anyone. Daniel was different. He was careful, quiet, and thoughtful. He studied every detail before making decisions. The two men were opposites in many ways, but that difference had made them strong partners. Together, they built something real. Their company slowly grew. Small repair jobs turned into large renovation projects. Soon they were hiring workers, signing contracts, and gaining respect in the local business community. After years of hard work, they finally had stability. At least, that was what Daniel believed. The cafe door opened and Mark stepped inside, shaking rain from his coat. Daniel looked up and smiled slightly. "Long day?" Daniel asked. Mark forced a small smile and sat down across from him. "Something like that." Mark said. Daniel noticed something strange immediately. Mark avoided eye contact and seemed tense. Usually Mark walked into any room with confidence. But tonight he looked different. Nervous. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "What's going on?" he asked. Mark rubbed his hands together, slowly, as if searching for the right words. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke. "Daniel, there's something we need to talk about." The tone of his voice made Daniel's stomach tighten. "Okay," Daniel said calmly. "What is it?" Mark looked down at the table. "The company is changing." Daniel frowned. "Changing how?" Mark took a deep breath. "The board made a decision today." Daniel blinked. "Board," he said. "What board?" "Their company did not have a board. It was privately owned by the two of them." Mark finally looked at him. "We have investors now," he said quietly. Daniel stared at him in silence. "Investors? When had that happened?" Mark continued, speaking carefully. "They believe the company has potential to grow much faster. They want to expand into bigger projects and larger markets." Daniel slowly leaned forward. "And you agreed to this without telling me?" Mark did not answer immediately. "That's not the main issue," he said. Daniel's chest felt tight. "Then what is?" Mark hesitated before saying the words that would change everything. "The board voted today to remove you from leadership." Cafe suddenly felt silent. Daniel was sure he had misunderstood. "Remove me?" he repeated slowly. Mark nodded once. "They believe new leadership is necessary." Daniel stared at him, disbelief filling his mind. "We built this company together," he said quietly. 50-50. Mark looked uncomfortable. That was before the new investment structure. Daniel's voice became colder. "What did you do, Mark?" Mark finally met his eyes. "I restructured the company last month. The investors bought majority shares." Daniel felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. "You restructured it without me." "You signed the paperwork," Mark replied. Daniel's mind raced back through recent weeks. There had been many documents, contracts, approvals, financial reports. Mark often handled the legal side of the business, and Daniel trusted him completely. Suddenly, a painful realization formed. "You hid it in the paperwork," Daniel said. Mark said nothing. The truth was clear. Daniel had signed documents, believing they were routine business forms. In reality, they had transferred power away from him. "Why?" Daniel asked. Mark leaned forward slightly. "Because the company needed it." Daniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. So you tricked me. It wasn't a trick, Mark said firmly. It was a decision for the future. Daniel shook his head slowly. You betrayed me. Mark's voice grew harder. You were holding us back. The words landed like a heavyweight dot. Daniel blinked. Holding us back. Mark nodded. You move too slowly. Every opportunity becomes a long debate with you. The investors want growth now. Daniel stared at the man he had once trusted completely. For 10 years we built this company carefully, he said. And it worked. It worked, Mark replied. But it could have worked faster. Daniel sat back in his chair, trying to understand how everything had changed so suddenly. Memories rushed through his mind, long nights working together, celebrating their first big contract, helping employees when times were difficult. Those moments meant nothing to Mark. You should have talked to me, Daniel said quietly. I tried, Mark replied. But you always wanted to play it safe. Daniel felt anger rising inside him. Safe kept this company alive. Arc leaned closer, and risk will make it powerful. Daniel shook his head. No, he said softly. Risk will destroy it. The tension between them grew thicker. Mark looked away toward the window where rain continued to fall. Daniel, this decision is final. The words were cold and official. You're no longer part of the company. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. How long have you been planning this? Mark did not answer directly. A few months. Daniel nodded slowly. So while they had been working together every day, Mark had secretly been building a plan to push him out. You lied to me, Daniel said. I did what was necessary, Mark replied. Daniel stood up from his chair. The movement surprised Mark. You're just walking away. Mark asked. Daniel placed money on the table for the untouched coffee. There's nothing left to say. Mark stood as well. This isn't personal. Daniel stopped walking. For a moment he considered laughing. Not personal. 10 years of partnership had just been erased. Without turning around, he spoke quietly. You took something I helped build. With my life. Mark did not respond. Daniel finally looked at him one last time. I trusted you. Then he walked toward the cafe door. Outside, the rain was colder than before. Soaked his coat quickly as he stepped onto the empty sidewalk. He began walking without knowing exactly where he was going. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement. Cars passed by slowly, their headlights cutting through the rain. Daniel's mind was full of questions. How had he missed the signs? Why had Mark chosen ambition over loyalty? But deeper than those questions was something else. Pain betrayal felt heavier than failure. If the company had collapsed naturally, Daniel could have accepted it. But losing it because of deception was different. It left a scar as he walked through the rain. Other thoughts slowly began forming in his mind. Mark believed he had one. He believed Daniel was finished. But Daniel Carter had not spent 10 years building a company by giving up easily. He understood the business, understood the industry, and most importantly, he understood Mark. Mark was brilliant, but impatient. And impatience always carried risk. Daniel stopped beneath a streetlight and looked back toward the direction of the cafe for the first time that night. Anger burned clearly inside him. Not wild anger, cold anger. The kind that grows quietly. Mark had taken everything from him, his company, his reputation, his future. But Daniel made a silent promise to himself in that moment. One day, Mark would face the consequences of what he had done. Daniel did not know exactly how or when, but he knew something important. Betrayal creates a debt, and sooner or later, that debt must be paid. Months passed after Daniel Carter lost the company he had helped build. Life slowly began to stabilize for him. His consulting work was growing, and people in the industry started respecting his knowledge again. Still, one unfinished chapter remained in his mind. Mark Bennett, the man who had betrayed him, was now leading the company they once owned together. At first, Mark's expansion plans seemed successful. New projects appeared in the news, and the company continued announcing bigger deals. Investors praised Mark's bold leadership. But Daniel knew the business too well to be fooled by surface success. He watched quietly and studied every report that appeared in industry news. Then the first real problem appeared. One of Mark's largest construction projects, a massive riverside development, began facing delays. Materials were arriving late, costs were rising, and local authorities had raised concerns about safety approvals. These issues were not public yet, but Daniel could see the warning signs clearly. Mark had taken too many risks. Daniel sat in his small home office late one evening, reading through several documents on his laptop. Some of them were old company files he still possessed. Others were public records connected to the Riverside project. Piece by piece, he understood exactly where the problems were growing. And suddenly he realized something important. He had the power to destroy Mark's reputation. If the investors learned how unstable the project had become, they would panic. Money would disappear quickly. Contracts would freeze. The company's expansion could collapse within weeks. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. The opportunity for revenge had finally arrived. For months, he had imagined this moment. Now it was real. All he had to do was send the documents to a few important people: a financial, journalist, an investor group, or a government review office. Once the information became public, the pressure on Mark would be overwhelming. Daniel imagined Mark sitting in a meeting room, suddenly realizing everything was falling apart. The same shock Daniel had felt months earlier. The thought gave Daniel a brief sense of satisfaction, but the feeling faded quickly. He closed his laptop and stood up, walking slowly toward the window. Outside, the city lights were glowing in the distance. Cars moved quietly along the street below. Daniel remembered the workers who still depended on the company. Some of them had been with him from the beginning. They had trusted both him and Mark to lead the business responsibly. If the company collapsed, those people would lose their jobs. Their families would suffer. They had done nothing wrong. Daniel returned to his desk and opened the laptop again. The documents were still there. The power to act was only one decision away. Mark had taken his company through deception. That pain had never fully disappeared. But another part of Daniel had grown stronger. During the past months, he had rebuilt himself slowly, had regained respect through honest work. Revenge might satisfy his anger for a moment, but it would also tie him forever to the betrayal. After a long silence, Daniel made a decision. The next morning, he sent a short message to Mark requesting a meeting. 2 days later, they sat across from each other in a quiet office conference room. It was the first time they had spoken since the night in the cafe. Mark looked tired and older than before. The pressure of managing a rapidly expanding company was clearly visible on his face. Daniel placed a thin folder on the table between them. "I know about the Riverside project," Daniel said calmly. Mark froze for a moment. I slowly moved to the folder. Daniel did not react. "The safety review coming next month." Mark leaned back in his chair. His expression had changed completely. Finally, Mark looked directly at him. "Destroy me with that information." Mark waited, expecting Daniel to explain what he wanted in return. That was how revenge usually worked in business. But Daniel surprised him. He slowly pushed the folder across the table. "I'm not going to use it," Daniel said. Mark stared at him in disbelief. "Why?" he asked. "Because revenge doesn't fix what was broken," he replied calmly. "It only creates more damage." Mark looked down at the folder again, speechless. Daniel walked toward the door but paused before leaving. "One day you might understand, but I'm not going to become the kind of person who lives for revenge." Then he left the room. Outside the building, the air felt fresh and light. For the first time in months, Daniel felt a sense of peace he had not expected. He realized something important as he walked down the street. Mark might continue running the company, and life would move forward in ways Daniel could not control. Sometimes the greatest victory is not defeating an enemy. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing who you refuse to become.